Enjoy with your headphones for a better listening experience.
Please watch till the end of the video to have the most scariest part of the story.
Episode 10, Eerie Towns, Diners, and Gas Stations. What's your story of a place that shouldn't exist? I live in New Mexico. My son and a friend were driving in the mesa just outside of town and saw a guy walking. As they drive by, they make eye contact. My son says he has yellow eyes and gives him a side smile, very creepy. So, his friend hits the gas to get away from this guy. Next thing you know, he goes from walking on 2 legs to running on 4, and he's not a man anymore but some weird-looking dog. They slammed the gas. The guy kept up for a moment, then they got past him. My son has never been one to lie, or tell stories, and was totally serious talking about this. I could tell he was freaked out. We were coming back from New York. And I asked my grandpa if he wanted to avoid toll roads, and he said yes, however he meant no, and that was a later issue. We ended up somewhere in the middle of nowhere. It was a gas station, and it had a dinner on the inside. Well, as my little sister and I are walking up, I see these 2 grown asses, me like 40-something, checking her out. She was in middle school at this time. They kept checking her ass out and whatnot. But we decided to enter the gas station/diner. You ever seen those horror movies where an outsider walks in and everyone stares? I shit you not, we walked in, and all the commotion died on the inside and everyone was just staring at us. Never been so creeped out before in my life. I grew up in southern Ohio, and there were always rumors of a Satanist church somewhere off the highway in a really rural area. Some people apparently went into the building where it was, and there were animal bones/blood all the over place and seemingly a ritual sacrifice thing going on. People had stories they got chased out by creepy-ass backwoods people. One night we drove out to where the church supposedly was, away back on these creepy country roads, and there was a light on in the window of the building. I got out to take a piss when I think we heard people yelling from the house, jumped back in the car and all got FT out of there. Also, in my hometown, there's this guy who people just call creepy. I think it's like every night, he drives the same exact route through neighborhoods where we live, just cruising slowly, seemingly pointlessly. Then he drives downtown and goes to this warehouse and disappears inside for like a half hour before coming back out and heading home. I know people who have followed him through all of this. He even rammed one of my friend's cars when they were following him. He may just be mentally ill, but there's lots of stories about him being really creepy to women, so maybe he's not so innocent. I was traveling through rural Montana with my friend late at night. I noticed that our window was really dirty, which was made worse at night because the lights from oncoming traffic would highlight every smudge and smear. We were only about an hour from our destination, but I'd had enough, so I decided to stop at the first gas station I could find. We saw a sign for a gas station, but the sign was old and unlit, which should have been red flag number 1, but I pulled over anyway and stopped in front of the pump. The pump was obviously way outdated, probably from the 70s, and the service station was boarded up. Right next to the service station was what looked like a small, abandoned motel or bed and breakfast. I stepped out of the car to survey this eerie environment and perhaps find an old paper towel or squeegee to clean off the window. As I'm walking around the pump, I noticed something move between the buildings. There was a man, probably in his 50s, sitting on an old lawn chair underneath the only working light. I was creeped out, but I knew I was probably overthinking things, so I just waved at him and gave a friendly howdy since I was in Montana. He raised his hand slightly in return, paused, and then stood up and proceeded to walk toward me. He moved out of the light and into shadows, which probably made me jumpier. I decided to ask if there was a squeegee nearby, but he didn't respond. At this point, I heard my friend in the car as he nervously said my name. The door was still open. I jumped back in the car and ripped out that gas station as fast as the good Lord would let me. When we drove back a couple days later, we saw the gas station in the motel, but it was definitely abandoned. I don't think it was a ghost at all, but I do think some creepy dude chose a very poor place to live. An upscale Chinese restaurant in an otherwise terrible neighborhood. Houses were in bad shape and the unemployment rate in the neighborhood was fairly large. Furthermore, this place had two different dining rooms. One for normal guests and the other section was slightly elevated behind walls made of glass. I was there fairly often, because they prepared great meals for a good price. I never felt more like eating in a restaurant owned by the mafia than I did at this place. The Midnight Carnival. Right, so I was 18, just a couple years ago, and I had just received my driver's license and purchased my first car. The noble Subaru Legacy had not yet been christened with a longish overland journey, and I'm prone to wanderlust, so one Thursday in June I elected to take a spin around Rainer. Left my small-ass town on the western side of Washington and made good time over Chinook Pass. Eventually, I arrived in Yakima. A fun pointless trip to the east side, but I didn't have to be at work the next day, so I pressed on. I decided to loop back around south of Rainier, and drive along until I eventually hit I-5, which I would take north until I was home again. A tidy little loop around the mountain. I finished my dinner in Yakima, and raced the setting sun to White Pass, hoping I would at least see some of it in the evening light. Natives of the region will note that there's nothing out there at all. Darkness began to fall, and all artificial lights were fading in my rearview mirror. Unlike everywhere else I have been in Washington, the huge black hills and mountains were completely devoid of lights. Furthermore, the roads were positively empty. Not a soul passed me for hours. It was like driving through the Midwest. The night was wearing on. I dutifully stowed my phone in the glove box so I wouldn't be tempted to run the battery down from music. Not that there was any service. I had been driving for 2 hours, lost in the Black Hills when I saw a spot of light on the horizon. I knew I was pretty close to a town called Morton, and I was craving vitamin water for whatever reason. The speed limit drops, and with it the scene comes to focus. A Ferris wheels. Lots of Christmas lights. Clowns, folk running around in makeup and stalls. My car clock dutifully burns 12:30-ish in my dash. Let me state this twice, there wasn't a soul near me for 2 hours. The hills were utterly dark. But here we are. In the middle of nowhere with a carnival, tents, clowns and all. I didn't stop for that ubiquitous gas station food. It took me an hour more to reach another town. I still pinch myself honestly. What a place for a fair. It feels like I missed a creepypasta. 390. I got lost driving around the Lancashire Hills almost 10 years ago. Found myself on a single-track road in a forest while it was snowing. I came across what seemed to be an abandoned house, but I couldn't see properly because of the snow. I tried to go back there more than once but never found the place again. One night during a vacation my parents ended up in some boony spot near Wilmington, North Carolina. They pulled up to a pool hall that was surrounded by trees, nothing else. There were just 2 young rednecks in cowboy hats standing inside. They looked at us like, who are they? Let's go outside to kick their asses. My parents decided that was a good time to drive off. I was driving from Albuquerque to San Antonio and stopped at a truck stop. It was so strange. The place was huge. It looked like a mall inside. But it was very old and run down. There was no one around either. It was open, had electricity, and the shelves were stocked with things that were probably 20 to 30 years old. I remember seeing cans of oil on the shelves. After waiting for like 10 minutes I put my bag of chips back on the shelf and left. This was a while back. I was driving with a friend from Montreal to New York. We stopped at this place called Dover Plains because there was a McDonald's and we needed some rest. We were way behind time, so we asked some local teens if there is a shortcut to get to the 84. They tell us to take a side road near the Dollar General. he got into this town that was straight out of the Hills Have Eyes movie. At 19 I had an epic night of psilocybin adventure. Ended up in bumfuck Kentucky somewhere at a very rural gas station / hardware / grocery store run by a guy that I'm pretty sure was Captain Spaulding. At one point I opened a loaf of bread and grabbed a tub of butter and cackled profusely while making butter sandwiches while this old, retired clown guy behind the counter just watched and laughed. He eventually told us it was time to get out. Never charged us for the food / mess we made. This is a really minor one, but on the stretch of road right before you get to my home there is a house that has been empty for at least a year or two. The porch was brand new around the time I moved here 3 years ago but has since fallen from the house and become overgrown. I have never needed a soul inhabiting the structure. I come home from work late at night, between 1 and 3 a.m., and I have never seen a light in the house or even tire tracks in the unplowed driveway. Even so, on 2 occasions now I have seen smoke rising from the completely dark house, again, in the wee hours of the morning, with no signs whatsoever of anyone having come or gone. I always look at this house when I pass and have only seen smoke those 2 times, so it's not even like someone is popping in to keep pipes from freezing. And why no plowed driveway / tire tracks? I don't know. When I was a kid, I liked to search for beach grass with my mother along the lake my grandparents lived near. I was 5 or 6, and thinking I was a toughie, I plowed ahead of my parents. I stumbled across this inlet thing that had a waterfall going down it. The water was the clearest I've ever seen, like something from a fairy tale. At the bottom of the falls was a ton of the most beautiful beach glass I ever saw. They were rounded like pebbles, yet individual in size, shape, and color. Since the water was so clear and the sun was hitting it just right, it cast a multitude of colors over the stone surroundings. I wanted to dive in and collect my bounty. But I had a big fear of deep water then. So, I ran back to get my dad to help collect it. When I tried to drag him and my mom back, I couldn't find the inlet. It was just a stone cliff face. Sometimes I go back to that lake and try to find that inlet, but I can't find it no matter how far I go up and down the beach. At this point, I'm certain little kid me found some sort of fairy isle. But I'll never be sure. Many moons ago, I was required to help a politician campaign in order to earn some bonus points for a government class I was in while in high school. I'm from Southern Illinois, and the day I was picked to help, we traveled up to Centralia, Illinois. I have never had such a strange experience. I don't know if it was just this day we were there or if this was every day, but I have never been reminded of Silent Hill more than I was that day. To start things off, this was a Sunday morning / early afternoon. While we were there, which was about 3 or 4 hours, the town was covered in a pretty thick crazy fog. We did traverse up and down what appeared to be the main street. There was not a single person out. There is nobody driving around, there were no citizens walking around, and it was very still. The 2 classmates I was with, and I headed off together to go knock on a few doors in order to pass out flyers at a couple of nearby neighborhoods. Everything was within walking distance. The next weird thing we noticed while heading down the road was a very small pickup truck sitting behind a small 4-door car. In both cars were 2 gentlemen who appeared to just be sitting in the cars. This would have been well before, the time of smartphones. So, this was way more strange back then. From what I remember seeing them sitting in their cars, respectively, both just appearing to be staring at the steering wheel. My classmates did not seem too concerned, but apparently it struck a chord with me because I still remember fairly clearly that day. Everything was cool for a little bit, pretty normal, kind of boring, a lot of people that were annoyed with us bothering them. But then we got to someone's house and one of my classmates went out to knock on the door. The gentleman living there opened his door and growled at her. And when I say growl, I mean a sort of low, guttural growl. She was not the type of person to really scare easy, so she just kind of rambled through the spiel. The man said nothing but just stared at her, and then shut the door. He did not attack us or say anything mean. Again, it was just very strange. We continued to walk around this neighborhood, everything still very still, nobody out in their yards. It was all so eerie, and then we stumbled upon this large concrete abandoned building that, if I remember correctly, was a former institution for mentally ill patients. It seemed very old, creep level of 10 for sure, and was all boarded up. We kind of all talked about this building, then walked around it for a bit. We did not try nor even talk about going inside. Back then even we knew that was a dumb idea. We began to head back into the main part of town. Keep in mind that this was maybe an hour or so more since we left the main part of town. As we walked back the same way we came, we passed those two weird cars, with the same guys still sitting in the cars, staring at their steering wheels. Part of me wants to think this was just some sort of a bruise or hoaxtra or something that people were playing, but that does not really make much sense. The last creepy thing I really remember was that the local church bells began to ring at noon. Now, normally this would not mean much or be anything to me, but this weird day we had been having just really made those 12 bells seem so demonic or evil. That is on top of the fact that no one went in or came out of the church in the time we were there. I know services in my own hometown go, individually, at 8 and 11. And that was it. We got back on the bus and drove away. No one got hurt and nothing bad happened at all. But that was over 10 years ago, and I remember it like it was recently. That has to say something about the experience. I'm way late to this, but there's a little ghost town in Texas near the Oklahoma border called Spanish Fort. It is basically abandoned except for some nearby small houses, but at one point there was a diner, gas station, general store, and a church and a small courtyard. If you go there, unless it's been blocked off since I was there, there's an open door into the diner, and it is creepy as hell. The dining floor is covered in Time magazines and other remnants from the 80s when the whole town was seemingly shut down all at once. I found the Time magazine cover of Reagan when he won re-election, along with plenty of other Time capsules. It's not a place that shouldn't exist, but more of a place that doesn't exist in any real sense of the word. Just a bunch of buildings in a row that haven't been cared for since the Cold War. Pretty sure I had an out-of-body experience when I was little, like 2 years old. It's one of the not memories I have from that youth since it was so vivid. I was lying on our couch in the living room, and I remember the room being bluish from the light outside. Then I felt light and started rising until I was stuck on the ceiling, looking down. This was the middle of the night and no one was around. This was at a bar where I was dating the female bartender, who is quite attractive. So, I get a call from her to come visit her since there was no one really there and we could BS the whole time and look over school stuff. We shared a college class. As she was checking on other people at the bar, a man walked into the bar. It was around 3 p.m. He wore our dirty white t-shirt, dirty jeans, had a few days of shadow on his face, and shaggy dirty blonde hair with a gore. As the door shut behind him, it was clear there was more going on. His left arm was wrapped a bit with blood on it. His t-shirt also had blood all over it. I turned around thinking, what is this? He comes strolling over to me. On my right was an empty bar stool, and next to that was the bit in between where you can't sit because the registers and all of that were there. What was also there was a Jägermeister cooler where it pours shots. So, he sits down on the seat on my right. He asked my girl if he could get a glass of water. She obliged without really paying attention as I gave her my full eyes wide open trying to get her attention that this guy isn't quite right. She didn't notice me doing that. She walked away and he slammed his water. He then looked at me and then pointed at the Jaeger machine. "What's that?" he asked. The Jaeger shot thing?" "What?" "It pours shots of Jaeger. It's a black licorice-tasting liquor," I explained. "Oh," he said as he stood up and darted toward the door. No one else at the bar seemed to even notice anything that happened. They didn't even flinch or look at all. The girl I was dating came back and I excitedly told her what just happened, but she was so in the zone that she didn't even notice she gave him water. So, I don't know what the hell that was, but a dirty, bloody guy. Walking into a bar and not knowing what was going on at all was quite freaky. That bar is the strangest place I've been to. She started slowly changing into a weirdo as well. Never again. Turks and Caicos, right when the resorts first started opening. Decided to explore a bit, and eventually came up on a convenience store that looked a bit abandoned, with no gas pumps. Kind of out in the middle of nowhere, but still on a road, so it wasn't like we'd gone way off track. At this point, we'd been out for a while and people needed to pee, so we decided to change it. The place was totally open, but dark. Shelves were semi-stocked, but dusty as all hell. Not a single other person was in sight. We poked around a bit just because it was so odd. But we didn't take anything. After a bit we decided to try to find a bathroom in town instead. No idea what was up with all of that. It's not that way now, but 2009 Cape Coral, Florida where I live. At one time, during the real estate crash, we were second in the US for the sheer number of foreclosures in the nation. Second only to Las Vegas. This was not per capita, this was real numbers. Las Vegas had a population close to 900,000 people and we had 150,000. The street I live on had 8 houses with a lot of vacant lots. 5 of the 8 houses went vacant in about 2 months. People with families. The whole neighborhood was that way. And then, while those of us still living there were out working in the day at jobs, people came into the vacant houses and stripped the copper out of them. They would raid the ACs and in the case of the house next door to me, pull the wires through the drywall. All those houses as of 2015 had people living in them and now there is a boom and there are 5 new houses on the street. It was a weird few years. My wife forgot to lock her car one night in those bad years and someone stole all her CDs. My wife listens to Christian CDs, so I am guessing that did not go as planned. A friend and I were driving to FL in the early 20-somethings. We were driving through the middle of the night to beat the traffic. We needed to stop to use the restroom and the next exit was Unadilla. There were no streetlights on. We weren't even sure if there were any buildings except a completely dark concrete gas station, but we couldn't be sure because it was so dark. It was like the electricity for the whole place was out. We decided to turn around and go back to the interstate. We see some zoned out looking people just walking in the middle of the road at around 2 or 3 a.m. Looking straight ahead like they didn't even see our car. A little farther down the road and we see a couple more zoned out people just walking straight ahead. We call them the Unadilla zombies. Unadilla and its zombies still come up every once in a while. It doesn't sound that scary, but it was really weird and sure scared a couple of young girls. It was my 2nd or 3rd year of college and I was living off campus. I stayed at my parents' house one weekend, and on my way back to my apartment, there was some other town where my college town should have been. None of the buildings were familiar, and I didn't pass any of the landmarks that I usually pass when going this way back to school. I am 100% sure that I didn't go a different way or make a wrong turn, because I turned around in a driveway and headed straight back the way I came. And drove until I saw something that looked familiar, and decided to turn around and head straight back. This time, I passed the usual landmarks and ended up in the town I was supposed to be in, just like normal. Around January 2007 I made the trek out to LA from Indiana with a friend of mine. Around the Oklahoma/Texas border we ran into a blizzard and after running into several miles of overturned semis the interstate was eventually shut down, and we were forced into an off-ramp and into a small town called Shamrock, Texas. We go into the first hotel we see and the lady at the counter tells us that they're all booked up. She also informs us that her brother's the town sheriff and that he said noon's allowed back on the interstate so we should look into a motel on the other side of the overpass. We head over to the motel and my car ends up getting stuck as I'm entering the driveway. It's about 2 to 3 a.m. and a gentleman who looks like he's had his fair share of meth appears out of nowhere and offers up help. We're able to back the car out, and when it becomes evident we won't be able to make it into the motel parking lot, he tells us we can store the car at his house and that it's safe with him because his uncle is the town sheriff. We politely declined there. Apparently the interstate was open after all. I live in Las Vegas, and southern Nevada is crazy big and populated. As soon as you go north from Las Vegas towards Reno/Carson City, there are nothing but ghost towns the entire way. Tons and tons of places that don't exist anymore. Once in a while you'll see some bikers taking a rest there or something, but that's really it. A lot of these towns don't have a single person living in them. My hometown in Ohio has a famous and very eerie road called Morningstar Road. Nobody seems to know the whole true story, and I'm sure some details have been exaggerated over the years, but basically there was a house fire in like the mid-1800s on one of the only homes on this road at the time that killed a few kids and the mother who was also home with them. Blaming herself for not being able to save her children, she either went psycho and murdered people or killed herself right outside. When the father got home later that day to charred remains of his former home and also bodies of his entire family, he too killed himself, or so the story says. Regardless, there were deaths due to house fire on that road in the mid-1800s. I can say from first-hand experience being on this road, and also stories told from trusted friends and family, that the road is very eerie and mysterious feeling, especially at night near where the house used to be. Many people claim to have seen the mother disappear from the road and into the woods that led right up to the road. I'm sure there's more details I missed, but look up Morningstar Road, Ohio. We went to Salem, Massachusetts around Halloween when I was a kid. I remember it vividly being creepy as fuck. We got into town late at night and our hotel was in the middle of town, the Lafayette. It's still there, I think. Anyway, as my parents were checking in, there was a brawl across the street and a dude got thrown into a store window. It shattered and the guy was all bloody. They all took off, and people at the hotel were like, oh, NBD. Other creepy shit during that trip as well. Not really a place, but something creepy in general. Me and my two friends would go out around the downtown area just walking around at night because we were in college, we had no money, and we weren't cool enough for parties. We would often walk through the dark back streets to get to a small park about 5 blocks away from the main downtown area. About halfway to the park, we pass this church on a rarely used road and we see some dude standing in the street. I looked closer and noticed that he's wearing a robe with a hood. The hood is on and it's making it hard to see his face. I slow down and instantly friend 1 says, "You see him too, right?" Friend 2 and I both say, yeah. We have to walk past the church to get to where we are going, so there's no avoiding this shit. We slowly start to pick up the pace, and once we have got a little too close he begins walking towards the church and drops to his knees. We walked past the scene, and we all felt that feeling like someone was watching us. Friend 1 didn't have to finish saying, "Let's run a bit," before we started sprinting down an alleyway. I used to live on the outskirts of a vineyard as a child. I used to walk the vineyard at night. One night my friends and I came upon a grand, old Victorian mansion that seemed abandoned in the middle of this $1 million vineyard with a pristine antique car in the open garage. Went in and looked around. The garage was actually an old barn, and eventually we freaked ourselves out and ran for it. Rural Ohio, driving in the middle of nowhere. Saw a little valley and went towards the center. Small town of about 8 stores, all closed. Lettering on the signs looked like the 1950s. No houses nearby, just random scatterings of mobile homes, in a pretty haphazard manner, no organized rows, pretty good distance between them. Never been able to find this ghost town again. I know it was somewhere near Zanesville, but that's all I remember. Guessing was a coal town that went bust when a mine ran out. My younger sister and I were on a road trip through the Midwest, and I think we were somewhere just past the Kentucky border heading west. We both really needed to use the bathroom, so we kept our eyes peeled for an exit, but because we're women, we found ourselves locked into conversation, then realizing we'd passed an exit over and over until we were both about to piss our pants. Finally, there was an exit upcoming and I swooped on it without checking the road markers for any gas stations, restaurants, etc. We had to go, so we were going. This is where it began to get weird. Our cell service dropped off approximately 10 yards past the exit ramp. There were two ways to turn left which brought us back to the interstate, and right, which we assumed was toward whatever civilization there was. We tried to search for a McDonald's, gas station, whatever, but our phones were suddenly bricks. Still, we were basically vibrating, we had to pee so badly, so we went right. It was like an empty, basic movie set. No gas stations, no restaurants, no grocery stores, just one road with several residential streets shooting off away from the interstate. Huge church with a full parking lot. It was a Friday afternoon, and one convenience store. We pulled into the convenience store where we were able to do our business even though there was no one behind the counter the entire time we were in the place. While my sister was peeing, I started to go shopping for snacks. Every single item, including the milk and orange juice and packages of bacon, were out of date by at least a month. My sister came out of the bathroom and I practically dragged her to the car. There was such an overwhelming sense of nope that I was honestly afraid something had happened to our car while we were inside, and we couldn't leave now or something else cliché. The car started fine, but I still drove back to the interstate like I was being chased. As we were driving, my sister pointed out to me that all of the houses were old school, like cookie-cutter mid-century Leave to Beaver-ass old school, but looked brand new, and every single street had one of those ornate neighborhood markers with names like Orion's Forest and Sunset Palisades. As soon as we hooked that right to get back on the highway, our cell phones lit up with notifications and service, like we'd breached some invisible barrier. We talked about how creepy it was, and after about an hour we were so worked up, we decided to go back and take pictures. Even though we were 99.9% positive which marker it was and how far down the interstate we'd gone. Yep, you guessed it, we never found the entrance again. This is not 100% in line with the question, but fits with the spirit of it enough that I'm going to risk getting it removed all the same. When I was young, my brother, mother, and I were coming home from somewhere. I believe it was somewhere far. We live about 3 hours from a few major cities and from my mother's hometown, different directions, so 3-hour road trips were pretty standard as a kid. It was summer, and the air had that orange glow it sometimes gets in the evening in the summer after it rains. As we pull in, we hear a bell ringing. A deep bell, ringing slowly. We look and see an old-timey ice cream truck drive down the street. We had the typical American, plays shitty music and sells ice treats that aren't real ice cream trucks, but this we'd never seen before. It was hot and we wanted ice cream, so we went over. Inside the truck was a strange fluorescent light, and the employees, dressed in old-fashioned soda jerk-style outfits, all looked like they'd rather do anything but sell ice cream. And I mean real ice cream. Came out as scoops, came from a cow before being adulterated. My brother got a banana split and I got a milkshake. It was fine but nothing special. The truck pulled away slowly, the bell on top starting to beat out its droning sound again. That was the only time we ever saw or heard that truck come down our street, and if we'd come home even a minute later we'd have missed it. I'm sure there's an explanation for it somewhere, but I can't think of anything explicable. For a while I thought I made it up, then I found the plastic tray from my brother's banana split. It had been washed and was being used as a bin, and I asked him and my mother. They also remembered it, and don't really have an answer for what happened. If it was a promo or reenactment, why pick such a crummy, rainy, and humid day? Why not advertise it at all? Why didn't they stock better ice cream if it was a one-off thing? Why has nobody from my hometown I've asked about it seen it or know anything about it? It was strange at best. This happened 10 years or so ago. Was driving by LAX late one night with my mom, just out for a drive. Saw a road and turned down it. We ended up driving on the high-walled road with no other cars. All the lights were yellow. There were a couple branches off of it. Basically, this 4 or 6 lane road cut through LAX below the normal ground level. When I exited, we were dumped out on the southwest side of the airport by Dockweiler Beach. Totally normal. Except I can't find that road again for the life of me. I've driven that area a ton since that night and never came across the place again. My mom vividly remembers that night too. So, it wasn't just a hallucination or dream. Unless we both made it up, LOL. I drove a small hatchback, back in '89, before seatbelts seemed mandatory, and I was immortal. I was driving up the Atlantic coast, through Maine when this happened. It was noon, the sun was overhead. Dark forests were on either side of the lonely road I drove on. I hadn't seen a car in a while. I turned the radio off after driving for a while. There was something about the atmosphere that made me want to listen. I remember rolling down my window, cranking it around the spindle going 50 down this lonesome road in mid-October, winter's grasp tightening around each bend in the road, getting a little colder and seeing fewer leaves. In those dark wooded forests on either side, I thought I'd seen movement. Only from perfunctory glances at first, but it kept cropping up. Always peripheral. I chanced to glance sometimes, before whatever it was moved, but it was always still in those moments, as trees whizzed past. The hum of my engine lulled me into quiet. I didn't know how unsettled I should be. The forests of Maine are a dangerous place to be, but only at night, the locals will say. They have their legends. But I'm not one for stories, but their fair share of animals was enough to keep me wary. The sun dipped in the sky, this road seeming to last forever. It was maybe 5 hours since the start of this story and the road continued on. I'd passed 2 cars this time, both speeding past me going well above the suggested limit. I say suggested because it was the '80s. Everyone was immortal. I was headed to my aunt's house. She said I could stop along the way. I had these glorious plans back then, still daring and adventurous from college's warm air lifting me higher. Then I should go under my great wings. I was too confident, but my mind had been made summer last that I would travel up the coast, until the very tip of the country expired and all that was left was ocean. It was a fool's dream in hindsight, but I was supported, in part, by my aunt who offered shelter for a night. The car began sounding odd later on in the day. I had expected the drive to take no longer than 6 hours, and at this point, I had driven 6 on the mark. The engine sound suddenly changed, the guttural glugging of gas was now accented with a metallic bouncing. A loose screw caught in a fan, or a failing part on its last legs, an internal game of pinball where if the sound stopped, I knew I was toast. I don't remember much from this point on. Only vaguely zoning out in my delirious state of dehydration and hunger and highway hypnosis. The road had hypnotized me well and was ready to swallow its next meal. The shuffled movements from the forests that I mentioned earlier never left. Only my recognition of them. I regret not paying more attention now. It gives me chills to think of what it was. I remember pulling over, thinking I'd sleep at hour 7, afraid I would never make it out of the forest, and night quick upon me. I reclined my seat back, first looking in front and behind me in the mirror. The road stretched for miles both ways. Empty. I paused. I swore I saw a truck pass me not just 5 minutes prior. It was an old man driving, I remember. His face was so distinct. It was as if he was leaning forward in the seat, neck craned against the windshield trying to get a look at me as I passed him. Maybe he was going faster than I thought. Maybe he went around a bend 10 miles back and I lost him. Doing the calculations now, that would make him be driving ungodly fast. I lied to myself, then, afraid of the truth, drained from the day's driving, and intent on getting sleep. I remember the chill coming first. There was no sound, no crickets, no birds. All this forest seemed devoid of all life except for me. But the chill wound its way up my spine, slowly leaving goosebumps upon my legs and up to my head as it traveled. It had been a bright and sunny day, but night had truly fallen. It was the 8th hour of my drive. I got scared here. I called it nerves getting to me. I told myself to grow up, but I was right to be scared. I had been right all day. The thing I saw moving in the forest next to me had been following me, slowly seducing me into stopping, intent on eating me. It was no animal. It was a beast of the night, I am sure. I am not religious, but I know what it was. It was a demon. I saw red eyes glowing through the complete darkness. I heard the muffled thumps of massive hooves, and I smelled the decayed flesh of the damned. It crept slowly up to my car, my heart hammering faster and faster with each step it took, the air around me getting colder the closer it got. I remember my window freezing every second before being defrosted by my hot breath and then refreezing a moment later. The car wouldn't start. My heart told me that much. I didn't have to try, I knew I was good as dead. But from a ways away, I heard the thrumming of an engine, and I spared a glance from the monster now 5 feet from my car, standing tall in the middle of the road, to my rearview mirror. Bright headlights blinded me, throwing everything around into sharp relief. The demon wasn't there when I looked back. There were smoldering half-moons charred into the asphalt, I remember seeing when I got out of the car. The truck had pulled up and the driver had gotten out to check on me before I felt safe enough to step out of the car to look. So ended my days of bravery and youth, but the man who seemed to make the demon vanish had more to say that I cannot repeat for an oath I swore, but know that the words I've written are true, and the beasts of the night are realer than they seem. This story won't be really exciting, but here's what I got. My uncle has 2 kids who have grown up and moved out now, but this is back to when they lived with him. The younger of the 2 was a cousin, but she was also my best friend. We were super close. So anyway, they ended up moving and leaving the town, so I was kind of upset. The good thing is, they didn't go far, but their new location was weird. It was sort of a neighborhood, or small little living community out in the country. I just remember it being set up like a neighborhood and then there being a playground in the middle, yet it was not attached to any town. It was further away, but I liked to go out there when I could convince my parents to drive me. This place already seems kind of weird, but it gets weirder. My uncle's place was right on the edge of this little community, and to one side of the house was a normal lawn, and to the other side was a creepy forest. We never had any crazy weird things happen in the forest, the house on the other hand, but it just gave off a creepy, do not disturb vibe. One day, me and my cousin went snooping through the forest. Nothing real exciting as I already said, but here's what we found. It was in the middle of the summer. People had trees in their yards, but all the trees in this forest were dead. The first thing we come across is an old-looking abandoned car. My uncle had no explanation for this. As we went deeper, we found a little wooden building. It was maybe supposed to be a shed or something, but we didn't know why it was in the middle of the forest and not closer to the house. The windows were all broken. We were too spooked to see if the door would open. After walking in basically a straight line so we wouldn't get lost, we reached the end of the forest. The forest ended with a fence. On the other side of the fence just looked like some unoccupied fields. The fence, we realized, didn't circle around anything. There was just this line of fencing. At the end of the forest. Like I said, nothing weird happened there, but just the vibes it gave off were pretty unsettling, and the car and weird building with no explanation was kind of creepy. I grew up right next to a beautiful mountain. There was a campground there I went to many times as a child. About 12 years ago the last bit of the road got washed out in a catastrophic flood. The road was about 5 miles, so you could still hike into the campground. I had done the hike into the campground a handful of times in full and hiked around the area countless times. I decided to take my partner at the time to the campground. Now I'm a fan of psychedelic, and no newbie to them at all. Neither was my past partner. I had since moved, so it was about a 2-hour drive to the trailhead. We found an awesome old graveyard on the way and decided to check it out. Instantly I'm drawn to this very old graveyard from the 1800s. We both stared at it for a long time and decide to head on our way. The vibes are high, and I suggest eating some mushrooms. We had less than an eighth, I eat a little more than half and he eats the remainder. This isn't a heavy dose, but enough to feel for sure. We started a little later than planned, so I know we won't get to make it all the way in, but we're excited for the hike nonetheless. We start it and get to talking. I notice something is off. Different. He notices something too. I finally am able to put my finger on it. There are no sounds. No birds. No bugs. No deer or squirrels or critters in the bushes. Completely silent. It's also the first time I've never seen another hiker there. It was a beautiful summer day. Every other time I've done this hike there were at least a dozen other people out and about. I remembered the empty ranger station coming in, which was also a little strange but not crazy. It wasn't creepy, but there was a definite change in the air. About 2 miles in I noticed picked mushrooms along the trail. Weird, I thought. Considering we haven't seen another person around since we've come into the park. As we continued, we both found more and more. Tiny ones, huge ones, visible ones right on the trail and ones kind of hidden just off the trail I noticed on pea breaks. None of them were shriveled or dry, they looked freshly picked. We got about 3 miles in, I noticed the time and suggested we turn around soon. We continue on 100 feet and to the left we notice this field. It's sunnier than makes sense. The plants are different than anything I've seen up there, they look like something you'd see in Hilo, Hawaii rather than this area I'm familiar with. I try to write it off as the shrooms. My partner, who was wholly unfamiliar, noticed something was very different and mentioned it. We admired the beauty and turned around. It got dark much more rapidly than I expected, and time passed much more quickly, especially considering we were going downhill slightly now and not at all tired. When we made it back we discussed in detail the weirdness of it, hung out for about a half hour to regroup. The entrance was right by a river and still, no bugs, no birds, no people, no life at all except the trees and plants. We're leaving, talking about how weird it was when an odd silence came over us. The shrooms have worn off by this point. As soon as the silence had grown heavy, we heard sticks cracking out the window. We looked over and we see a deer. It stops, looks at us for what felt like a long time. Then continues in front of the car on its way. Immediately the back driver's side window of my partner's car rolls down on its own. We continue out and finally hear birds chirping, flies buzzing, and have a generally regular car ride back home. I'm not sure what happened there, but it was a good thing. It wasn't completely due to the shrooms either, considering our light dose, the lack of sound and the picked mushrooms we both found. It felt strange and healing and special, especially considering I've been going there since I was a kid. Overall, one of the best experiences I've ever had. There's a mental hospital that closed an old building way back. Kids go there all the time and look around. I went once and it was creepy. It was like all the patients and doctors literally just disappeared. You can find old medical records just lying around on the ground and in different rooms. The kitchen still had old equipment just sitting there. You can crawl through old electrical crawl spaces to other parts of the building. Some people have done graffiti glorifying Satan and stuff. 418. In 1993 they went on a trip with me at the time, fresh out of high school, and to check out some colleges up north in the Dakotas area. Not sure which state exactly, anyway. They decided to camp at a campsite that night. It seemed quiet, and a nice place to spend the evening. Well, for some reason they set up camp first and then went to play after. When they got to the payment window of the head cabin, it was deserted. Looked overgrown and like nobody had been there in years. Not wanting to take the chance, my parents decided to just leave the money in a bowl that was on the counter. They spent the night there and never heard or saw a soul. In the morning when they picked up the tarp under the tent to leave, the entire ground was covered in earthworms. Like a square 8 by 8 of pure earthworms. This story used to make me laugh as a kid, but now it's just completely unsettling. Another detail that's unrelated to this thread is that the next day, my dad, an avid birdwatcher, was driving the car with the box of firewood on top and saw a bird in the field next to them, and while looking at it blew through a stop sign, immediately panicked and slammed on the brakes, and the box of firewood just flew straight off the roof. My grandparents own 18 acres in the middle of nowhere. I wasn't supposed to go past the mowed portion of the field, but one day curiosity got the best of me, and I ventured into the tall grass and trees. I walked for a little bit, and came across what seemed to be an old, forgotten, one-lane dirt road. Nobody had ever mentioned this road before, so I was super intrigued. I walked down the road and it stopped at some train tracks. I knew there were train tracks somewhere sort of close by to my grandparents' house, but I'd certainly never walked to them before, especially alone. I walked down the tracks a few feet and noticed old clothes and cans. The trees are super overgrown around the tracks because the train doesn't seem to run anymore. Then I realized it took me so long to get there that it was now dusk, with night falling fast. I looked down at the tracks and it seemed to go on forever in blackness, with the tree branches ready to choke any train that may try to pass. I pretty much full ran the whole way back. Later asked about the tracks to my mom in passing, and she told me to never ever go there because that's where the crazy homeless people live. When I was a very little kid, I recall going to a beach, and seeing these perfectly lined up houses on stilts, like 20 feet up, with no windows, all lined up about 500 feet apart parallel to the beach. We walked around to the ocean-facing side, and there was no wall. It was like a cross-section of a house. There was a narrow staircase that went from the ground to the center of the house. I went in and watched Barney. For years I thought it was a false memory, until my dad confirmed it to be true. I remember I was only about 6 or 7 at the time, and my grandparents drove to Colorado to pick up my cousin and I. Both of our dads moved to Colorado and had summer custody. It was a normal road trip to Utah. I can't say where it was in Utah, but we stopped to get gas and it was like the whole town was empty. The gas station was open, but nobody was around, no cars driving, nothing. It was eerie and we got the hell out of that town. The only time something like this happened to me, seeing a place then never being able to find it again, was the night 2 of my good buddies and I happened upon the Satan Church. This was mid-1990s, BTW, when the satanic panic was in full swing and still being taken very seriously. In fact, we all wrote for our school newspaper. Yep, folks, we were the cool kids, and I'd just done an article on Raymond Belknap and James Vance, the 2 kids who'd attempted suicide and whose parents had blamed the lyrics of Judas Priest. So, this kind of thing was at the forefront of my mind. We'd actually been looking for another local unofficial haunted attraction, the Cult House. Instead, we stumbled onto this church, which wasn't abandoned or anything. Just looked like a small, stone, normal-looking church. As normal as the super old, made entirely out of stacked stone buildings get in this part of rural PA anyway. We looked inside and there were candles, unlit, an upside-down cross on a pulpit. Probably didn't start out that way, looked like it had been vandalized, and some typical Satan type of graffiti all over the walls. The church actually looked like it had been vandalized, and it had just happened that night. My buddy Matt said he'd heard kids came there to worship El Diablo, do sacrifices, etc. When we looked in another window and saw a candle still lit, we noted the heck out. Someone had been there a little too recently for our tastes. We tried to find it a few times after that, in daylight, and never could. That's actually one of the legends of the Satan Church. It only comes out at night. We did eventually find Cult House, though. Close to my old house there is an old government building, and as you walk past it and take a left, you get to a horribly overgrown sidewalk. Keep going a ways and take another left. There you will find one of the creepiest neighborhoods I've ever seen. There's just an air to it that says, I don't belong here. When my friend and I went there for the first time, we heard the unmistakable sound of a woman's scream in the distance. All other times we've gone, there have been no cars, except one time when a pickup drove past at an ungodly speed. Maybe I can't explain in a comment exactly what's so creepy about it, but just the whole experience of it is off-putting. And we got addicted to that. I was driving through rural Idaho to visit my brother. We were running out of gas and it was a really empty road. No gas stations, houses or anything. Eventually I see an exit and lights off in the distance. At this point I am desperate, so I pull off to see if it can be of help to me. I get to this warehouse-type building and park. The door is open, all the lights are on, so I go inside. There is a semi with the engine running. The trailer is about 20 feet away and it is filled with wood crates. The warehouse has several tanks like big propane or gas tanks. It is all very weird. Had the feeling like someone had just left. I called out, but no answer. 2 dogs run up and start barking, but no people. I hear voices talking in the distance. At that point I get real creeped out and haul ass out of there. After about 10 minutes I get to this house where they give me gas out of a jug. They had no idea what I was talking about. Checked Google Earth and there isn't any building in that area. There was a creepy abandoned house that was a couple blocks down the street. My friends one day all went in through a broken window to investigate. I did not go in. They came out saying it was way too cold in just one room in the basement, so they got out of there. This was on a Saturday. By Saturday the next week, poof, the house was gone. Any sign of a basement in terms of dug up dirt was gone too. Seemed a little too quick, even if there were construction crews out front. Me and a friend were driving back to our town from a nearby city. On the way we go through a couple of small villages along the way that are all on the same road. Because there's a low speed limit through the villages, we turned off the main road onto a country road that went the same way, but with no speed limit. Along the way we came to a train crossing on the road that showed a train was coming, barrier down, lights on, but made no noise. We sat at the lights for 10 minutes at least, only having a time reference from the music we had playing. The lights never changed, and the train never came past. Thinking we were the opening scene in a horror film, we turned back. We went back to the main road and passed over the open train crossing. The weird part is the roads are parallel with an open field separating them. We saw no train cross and the lights on the other crossing had gone out. Never been down that road again. Times Beach, Missouri. Not somewhere I personally live near, but it's just weird. Was just a small community off the highway, for decades. Around 2,000 people. Town was evacuated in the early 80s due to dioxin contamination and was then cleaned up, demolished, some years ago. Every time we pass by where it was, my dad brings it up. Talks about how my great-aunt and uncle lived up there and basically got kicked out of their homes. Now, every time we pass, he says something to the effect of, "Can you believe there used to be a whole community with rows of houses just right over there?" and then proceeds to point to an empty tree land. Just creeps me out for some reason. My friends and I drove to El Paso to visit a friend's dad in an ICE detention center. On the road there was a windstorm. We stopped to get gas at a gas station in the storm. On the way back where we stopped there was nothing there. So, about a year ago, my husband and I did a road trip from California to Texas to get some of my stuff after we got married. We did the drive back to CA in 1 minute. Well, it's 3 a.m., somewhere in New Mexico, and we are getting low on gas, and the last exit for gas was a while back. So, even though there's no sign for gas on this exit, there has to be a gas station, right? So, we find one eventually and barely in time too. The first red flag is there's only 2 pumps and the convenience store it's connected to is closed. Creepy flag number 2 is the bugs. Big nasty flying bugs everywhere. The fluorescent lights are shaded from the flying monstrosities. Even my normally okay with bugs husband was like, this is gross. Bad sign number 3 was the cats. At first it was just one little stray, a cute kitty. Then it was 2. Then 4. By the time we are done getting gas, there are 17 cats waiting around for us to feed them, sacrifice ourselves. We didn't go out there as fast as we could. There was a normal, well-lit gas station 2 miles down the road. This story requires some background. My dog had to have emergency surgery in a shitty town in NC over a holiday weekend. Once she was able to be moved, we had to finish our trip to FL, moving, with her. She had been cut from just under her ribs almost all the way down her belly. She was in pretty bad shape and moving very slowly. So we stopped at a rest area near a state forest and get the dog out of the van, by coaxing her onto a folded mushroom chair and lifting her to the ground, and let her use the strip of grass for her doggy duties. As she's taking the slowest shit of her life, I start to feel pretty uneasy. I look up and see pairs of shining eyes in the forest, maybe 50 sets. On the ground, up in the trees. The dog can't run. I can't carry her without probably tearing her sutures and killing her, and now there's tree demons checking us out. I realize it's cats, lots of cats, and while the dog is still shitting so slowly, epics came and went. I'm considering the likelihood of us being attacked by this congregation of cats. As if they can read my thoughts, a couple of them jump out of the trees and edge closer. At this point we're closer to the cats than the van, and the cats are about 2.5 car lengths away. It's midnight. My mother and brother are in the bathroom, all the way on the other side of the rest area. I'm armed with a small knife, but otherwise empty-handed, with a dog slower than Moses who can't be carried except on a litter. No. I convince the dog to walk toward the van while I walk backwards, watching the fantastic forest of felines. She's trudging slowly and the cats are walking closer. I tug as gently as I can on the leash and she gives me a look like, just let them eat me. Walking is hard. Eventually we reach the van, which I actually have keys for. Coax dog onto chair. Convince the dog to lay down. Lift chair into van. I haven't been able to check on the fearsome feline followers during this process. Convince dog to get off chair. Coax the dog to lay down. Slam sliding door shut, run around to open the hatch and fling the chair in, and the parking lot cats are starting to head back into the trees. Huge sigh of relief. So yes, 1 kitty is cute. 2 cats are fine. There is a crowd and 50 is no.
Thanks for watching. Please comment, like, share and subscribe. The Internet Surfer on YouTube for more horror and scary stories.